Hey there, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. I truly feel that we live in a time of fantasy, time when people believe things that are hard to believe otherwise, like dragons or elves, or thinking that some politicians have more influence on the world politics than they actually do. Times when some of the media journalists are listening to these politicians and then report on this, very seriously report on this, expecting that this will somehow bring some kind of a ceasefire between a party that just want to destroy Ukraine and Ukrainians that don't want to get destroyed. Or even worse, when some of these media sources are equating some kind of a temporary ceasefire with an actual peace. That's the weird fantasy period we're living in. So let's double back into some of the reality and talk about who actually have the weight and decision-making potential. And I want at least the viewers of this channel, whether you agree with me or not, to fully acknowledge that it's only Russia and Ukraine that can decide how this war is gonna end. More specifically, when we're talking about US right now is doing some kind of effort to bring closer a ceasefire, and Ukraine coming out with a proposal, when Ukraine comes out with that proposal, what they essentially agree to with United States, that is pretty much final. This is what Ukraine has agreed to, and Ukraine is not ready to move any further. That is Ukraine red lines. And Ukraine has outlined those red lines in paper, in statements, and Zelensky has been underscoring these red lines all along. And I want us all to acknowledge that Ukraine was never against a diplomatic solution to the conflict. But a diplomatic solution to the conflict does not mean that Ukraine just surrenders its lands, recognizes Russia's control of their lands, and just kind of moves along with their lives. No, it always is that instead of fighting, we are continuing working diplomatically to return the lands that officially belong to Ukraine. That is a completely different path from just acknowledging everything that Russia captured as the real thing, and even more ludicrous than accepting some of the Russian terms. Because this is exactly where we end up with. We talked about in some of the videos previously that Putin's response to Trump's proposal will be an indicator of how deluded Putin is on his journey to subjugating Ukraine, because Russia is not having a good time. We're going to touch about this later in this video. And we was trying to measure now if Russia is in a situation where they actually need some kind of ceasefire so they can recoup their forces, and actually it would be quite beneficial for Russia to get this no condition ceasefire for at least 30 days so they can prepare for their next offensive. However, from there, we start going into Russia rejecting this ceasefire nominally. We never expected that Russia will fully neglect the ceasefire. I mean, it's possible, there is always this 1%, but we mostly expect that it's going to be Putin saying, yes, we agree concretely, but, and then the important part is what is after that, but that's the indicator that we're looking at. And in that indicator, we wanted to measure how much do Putin gets deluded. And he got pretty deluded, because the less diluted thing was something that was speculated beforehand, that potentially Russia would want Ukraine to, I don't know, pull the troops away from the front line, or that we will see some kind of external forces come in to the front line, like Turkish or Belarusians would be proposed as a neutral state, or maybe some third party like Chinese troops coming in. You know, something that just kind of muddies the water, but still leaves a room for potential kind of discussion. And that would be like the Putin understands the need for the ceasefire, yet he still kind of wants to push his narratives forward and muddy the process just to kind of get the time and potentially get additional pressure to remove supplies of weapons to Ukraine. This is not where we ended up with. We ended up with like something that is much further than that, because Putin basically stated out that Ukraine needs not only just to stop receiving weapons from the United States, that any and all help needs to be stopped to be delivered to Ukraine, that Russia should put their observers on the border with Ukraine, and then they need to check that the weapons are not coming to Ukraine. And this is just one side. Russia is not giving anything on that. Putin also stated that it needs to be tackled the root causes of the conflict for Ukraine, essentially again poking at legitimacy of Zelensky, talking about elections, the all of the unjustified turnover of Ukraine, creation of Ukraine, the election of Ukrainian government, disregarding Ukrainian state. Then he talked about demilitarization of Ukraine, that Ukraine should not be this powerful, and then he went in a complete fantasy land. And this is, by the way, where I saw the crazy pills. Like Trump came out with the statements that Ukrainians are encircled, and I was face palming because I thought it was obvious where that perception is coming from, because Putin said it in his own interview. Putin specifically talked about the Ukrainians being supposedly encircled in Kursk, which is completely untrue. There is no encirclement. We can go over it maybe in the next video if that's going to be a real topic, but I think it's been covered by pretty much any observer of Ukraine by this point, that there is no encirclement. Yet this is the fantasy narrative that Putin has been putting forward, and this is the fantasy narrative that Donald Trump just kind of swallowed up and just spit forward to the whole unsuspected people that are just watching him uncritically and are not following the war that is ongoing in Ukraine. Most relevant is like, what is the actions of Ukraine and what are the actions of Russia? And right now, the actions of Russia are very simple. They just muddy the water, and Putin specifically is deluded to an extent that he does not want this war to end. The only thing that he's looking for is potentially additional aid to be removed for Ukraine. Now, we've heard extensively that potentially Trump is going to be pressuring Russia, but so far it's just been a lot of blah, blah, and there has been zero actions that harmed Russia in any way. All of the words and rhetoric and actions that have been done so far was there to pressure Ukraine. We have seen zero pressure on Russia. Zero, exactly, from the Trump administration. So that's why I say it is important to understand where Ukraine stands and where Ukraine will definitely not go. Because a lot of the people are assuming that if Trump just at some point decides to again turn off the weapon supplies for Ukraine, then Ukraine is just going to fall over and submit to everything. That is not what's going to happen. And I'm really glad that while Putin is playing games, as stated over here, Ukrainians very clearly outline what are their red lines. First and foremost, they are not recognizing shit that Russia has captured. That is obvious to anyone. Secondly, they will never agree to any kind of additional territory being given to Russia. Essentially, like stating, expecting that some kind of cities or additional parts of the region that Russia just proclaimed as their own will be handed over to Russia is absolute nonsense. It's never going to happen. And most importantly, the requirements on prisoner exchange and return of the civilians that are not, like, because they're not military prisoners of war, yet they're still kind of within the Russian occupation. So there is just no proper mechanism to return those people to Ukraine, because they're not supposed to be like as a prisoner exchange program. And most importantly, the kids to be returned to Ukraine. Those are the absolute red lines for Ukraine. So Ukrainian territorial integrity, absolutely zero steps back to that. And secondly, return of the people that are illegally held by Russia. That is the only condition for the potential of the start of the talk between Russia and Ukraine. That's it. Everything else is just a farce. So people that are stating or expecting that there's supposed to be some kind of a ceasefire agreement or peace negotiation starting, I'm sorry guys to say, but you are living in a delusion land. Most important, I think, is for countries to take a more pro-independent positions. That's why, like, I'm happy to hear that President Macron is actually stating that we will not ask Russia for permission to deploy our troops in Ukraine. My question is, why wait until ceasefire to deploy troops to Ukraine? deploy them now. There is plenty of territory in Ukraine where Russia is not even closely present, and you can just deploy your troops to cover Ukrainian civilians from attacks by the Russian missiles. Believe me, it will not cause a nuclear war, because again, I'm still waiting from the previous 10 or 15 times that we're all supposed to be nuked. Therefore, long story short, the war goes on, and it's extremely important to look at ourselves, what we are doing, and most importantly, what Ukraine is doing to continue fighting the Russians. Right now, Ukraine is still in a defensive posture, but they are moving and doing actions that will help them fight the Russians. In my last stream, we already talked about the long Neptune missile. It's a Ukrainian homemade missile that is able to target Russian infrastructure all the way in a distance of up to 1,000 kilometers, which is a very, very good distance for Ukrainian developments. Therefore, Ukrainians are very happy to have them on board. But moreover, Zelensky also stated that now new type of drones have been tested and are ready to be deployed against Russians that can strike targets of up to 3,000 kilometers away. That is massive. 3,000 kilometers already allow Ukraine to reach some very, very important targets for Russia. If you didn't know, a lot of the Russian industrial centers, maybe not even Russian, like the Soviet industrial centers, they were specifically put in that area that is right behind the Urals mountains, behind the European part of Russia, just so they're close enough to get their production to the European part relatively quickly, yet far enough so any aggressor would not be able to easily target those. Is already great for Ukraine, because now Russians know that they are not safe. But more importantly is what is happening inside of Ukrainian military. Now, one of the biggest critiques against Ukrainian military that was in discussion the whole last year internally in Ukraine was the fact that with the appointment of General Syrskyi and with Zaluzhny being replaced, that it felt that a lot of the Soviet-style military command came back to Ukraine. And since then, Ukrainians have had a lot of internal issues. There were issues on the front line. And finally, we saw at the end of the year, the movement towards resolving those issues. It was including the removal of certain Soviet butcher-style commanders that have been reported by the Ukrainian armed forces, not without any problems, and there is a lot of issues still there. But more importantly, it's replacement of some of the key individuals to be replaced by now new types of people that have been battle-hardened and then know how to command Ukrainian armed forces in tough situation. This time we have new appointment by the General Gnatov that has pretty good clout inside of the Ukrainian military. He is, I believe, a general with 27 years of military experience, and he is known in this war firstly by the protection of the Mykolaiv region, which is when Russia, in the first onslaught, they crossed the river Dnipro and took over the city of Kherson. Then they tried to move along the coastline towards Odessa, but in the way there was the city of Mykolaiv, and that city never fell to Russians, and the efficient defense was also done to the thanks to this General Gnatov. And then secondly, he's also the commander in charge of the defense of Bakhmut. So one of the bloodiest Russian of assaults, one of the most devastating battles that Russia had in this war period, the way that they tried to capture Bakhmut. Now, there's obviously evaluation whether strategically Ukraine should have or should have not defended Bakhmut, but the defense of Bakhmut itself was done pretty well. It cost Russia one of their most elite units. The whole saga of Wagner going towards Moscow was basically triggered thanks to this guy in a large sense. So great appointment, and he's now appointed as a head of the general staff. Really good change, and he will oversee the transition of the Ukrainian armed forces into the core system going further. Then let's get to the news bad for Russia, because in Lithuania, Russian spies have been accused to setting the fire to IKEA. As a reason on what they did this is because, well, IKEA has yellow and blue, and we thought it was in support for Ukraine, therefore we set it on fire. And if you think that sounds like a really stupid argument to have, well, should I remind you that we have an interview with these two fellas who are the Russian agents, confirmed Russian agents, that conducted a poisoning with Novichok on the territory of United Kingdom in the city of Salisbury. And they were telling to the interviewer of the RT why exactly they were on the territory of UK. So please listen to this sound fragment.
What were you doing there?
Our friends had been suggesting for a long time that we visit this wonderful town.
There's the famous Salisbury Cathedral, famous not only in Europe, but in the whole world. It's famous for its 123-meter spire. It's famous for its clock, the one of the first ever created in the world that's still working.
Yeah, so the thing that we always need to remember that they're not the best and brightest that are working for the Russian agencies. But things are not getting better for Russia at all. We have talked extensively that Russia in 2025 will have a very difficult and problematic year, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And I said that for Ukraine to essentially crush Russia, the same amount of pressure that was ongoing so far just needs to continue. We don't need to do anything. And just to put it in a perspective, let's look at some of the numbers, because Russia has stated what their budget deficit spending is for the months of January and February, and they said it's $31.5 billion. Now, that is a lot, because if we look at the Russian rubles, it is 2.7 trillion Russian rubles. And you might ask, well, is it a lot or is it a little? Well, firstly, compared to the previous year, it is more than double, because previous year it was 1.13 billion rubles, and this year it is 2.7. So it is already more than 2 times than the same period last year, the budget deficit. And most importantly, the actual planned budget deficit, and I shit you not, the planned budget deficit of Russia was expected to be 0.5% of GDP, or 1.173 trillion rubles. Yes, you heard it right. Russian planned budget deficit, the target budget deficit for 2025, was planned to be 1.173 trillion rubles, and only in the first 2 months, Russia is now at 2.7 trillion rubles. To put it in comparable numbers with the last year it was 34 billion US dollars, the budget deficit. And in just the first 2 months, Russia is now at $31.5 billion. It is hard to overstate just how screwed Russia is, because we know that actually when you look under the hood, the things are even worse, because this is the federal budget and there is also the region budget for Russia. And like inside of those regions, there has been bigger issues than the whole federal budgeting system. There are actually much more things that are problematic for Russia, because essentially they are expected to gain a revenue from the regions, because regions are indebted as well, but they are now stating that the regions will not be able to pay back that money to the Russian federal budget. So Russia potentially will have even less money in their income statements, so their budget deficit again will go sideways. It is really, really bad for Russia. And you might say, it was like, well, Russia wasn't rich, was it not? Well, yeah, it was, because all this time, all these previous years, Russia was living on their war chest, the war chest that Putin accumulated. That war chest has been going down, 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 and down. So far, the only liquid assets that Russia has left is literally just gold and Chinese yuan. That's it. And the total number that Russia had in this piggy bank by the January of 2025 is $38.42 billion. So 38.42 in the piggy bank, and in the first 2 months, Russia went into 31.5 billion. To put it in simple terms, if your whole economy has only 7 billion in savings, actually even less, because to be honest, not the fact that Russia can actually sell the gold at that price, and it was values that we had at the beginning of January. There might have been going down more than that. But even if we take those numbers, Russia is broke. That's what we need to understand. By the end of 2025, Russia will have no savings whatsoever. And don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that the Russian economy will collapse. No, what it means is that Russia will finally start feeling the pain of this war. Beforehand, they were able to offset that pain, and regular Russians and Russian companies and so on were able to operate relatively normal-ish. Now they will be forced to start cutting into the flesh of the Russian economy. So when we go in 2026, the pain is going to start rising and rising and rising and rising and rising for Russia and Russians. We are there. Russia is broke, and the only way forward is for them to actually start printing the money, because the piggy bank is empty. They're empty the whole yearly piggy bank that they had for this year in the first 2 months. And things are not going better for Russia with the equipment front. They are literally running out of their armored vehicles and tanks. And you can see it on the chart. So this is the whole chart post-Russian full-scale invasion starting in February 2022. And you can see as the losses ratio of armored vehicles in red and tanks in blue compared to the number of unarmored vehicles in losses has been falling and falling and falling and falling. This is what I say that Russian production cannot keep up. That they were able to sustain supply of vehicles only because they had this massive stockpiles. And Ukrainians have been doing a great job at destroying it. So when you're talking about should or should not Ukraine surrender, we need to understand that Ukraine has never been in such a favorable position in this war beforehand. We're finally seeing some dedication from the European allies. We're finally seeing Ukrainian systems and factories coming online and getting their production up to speed, six-folding it since the last year, for example. And it's going to be growing even more this year. And we're seeing Russia finally running out of stockpiles, and now they need to sustain themselves with whatever pitiful production they're having in the face of their economy hitting a brick wall by the end of 2025. So Trump is the only salvation that Putin has. And we already discussed at the start of this video that no matter how tough of a picture Putin draws to Trump, how much he bluffs in the face of United States, everything is still dependent on Ukraine. Ukraine is a much stronger position that anyone is giving it credit to. So do not write the Ukrainians off. Do not write the Ukrainian army off. Do not write Ukrainian production off. And do not write off just how much pain Russia is in. Because they're good at hiding it, but the reality and data shows they're full of shit. Support this channel. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't. This really helps push the video up. But most importantly, support the Ukrainian armed forces. Trust in Ukrainian armed forces. I love you. Slava Ukraini, and I will see you next time.